Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining our Alliance team today. We're delighted to have Dr. Stephen Marans and Professor Marcy Hamilton here with us so we can learn more about the effects of childhood sexual trauma and how it relates to statute of limitations reform here in Connecticut and in the United States. Year after year, both as a survivor of childhood sexual abuse and as someone committed to ending sexual violence, I continue to be dismayed at the rates of sexual violence experienced by our children. Over the last year alone, as the pandemic increased isolation and social and economic hardships in our communities, we saw a nearly 10% increase in children under the age of 18 disclosing experiences of sexual violence. We know that we need to do more to protect and support our children, as well as to hold those who cause harm or help to facilitate causing harm accountable. Today's conversation is an important step in working towards supporting our children, supporting our communities, and moving towards accountability. Lucy Nolan, who is the Alliance's Director of Policy and Public Relations, will be facilitating today's session, so I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Beth, and that was our Beth Hamilton, our Executive Director. Thank you for kicking us off. I'm very excited today. This is, this pairing of Dr. Marans and Professor Hamilton has really sort of broken our internet with the number of people who have registered. So we know that this is an incredibly important issue for so many of you, childhood trauma and also the statute of limitations. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and specifically Dr. Marans and Professor Hamilton. Before we get started, I just want to do a couple things. One, it will be recorded. If you registered, we will send a link out to you, but it will also be on our website, and we have a YouTube channel as well when we do get it uploaded. There will be opportunity to ask questions through the question and answer portal at the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring that. Dr. Marans and Professor Hamilton will be able to see it as well as those of us who are running in the background of this. And then I also want to say, for many people, this can be a triggering event. And I just want to highlight that the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Violence does have a 24/7 hotline that is staffed by certified sexual assault counselors who will be able to help you if you just have a question, or if you are feeling a little panicked or whatever, anything. Please give us a call, because we're here to help survivors. So I just want to kick this off quickly, and I want to say thank you so much again. For Dr. Marans is going to speak, and then Professor Hamilton will speak, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. And I sort of asked what would be the important thing for me to highlight with Dr. Marans, because he has such a stellar background as a child and adult psychoanalyst, but also co-director of the Yale Center for Traumatic Stress and Recovery and Child Development, co-founder of the Child Development Community Policing Program. But one of the things that he really wanted me to highlight was as his role as a co-developer of the Child and Family Traumatic Stress Intervention, which allows decreasing in PTSD in children. They have a place to go. They have a way to work through and really helps with the traumatization and not having something follow them through the rest of their lives. And they work a lot with the child advocacy centers. And so it's really reaching a lot of children. So thank you for that. Professor Hamilton is a constitutional law scholar at the University of Pennsylvania, and she is also the founder and CEO of Child USA, which has been instrumental in helping us understand child sexual trauma abuse and also on the statute of limitations. And she has done a lot of work both federally and in the states on working on this legislation. So I'm going to kick it off to Dr. Marans, and we do have a slide presentation here. So we'll get that up. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth and Lucy. And I'm very glad to be with all of you today. So today I'm going to be talking about the traumatic impact of child sexual abuse. Next slide, please. In order for us to actually begin to think about why child sexual abuse is so significant, it's important for us to understand what do we actually mean by trauma and to think about the dimensions of the traumatic impact that so many children and then survivors of child sexual abuse experience. So first, as a starting off point, as a common frame of reference, we think of psychological trauma as an injury that involves an overwhelming experience of danger and a threat to physical and or psychological integrity that leads to a real loss of control, feelings of helplessness and confusion, in which there's a real immobilization of our usual methods for decreasing our experience and our feelings of danger and anxiety, referring to the fight-flight response, but typically in the trauma response, actually what people experience is immobilization. And we know a great deal more about the neurophysiologic dysregulation that actually occurs as a result of the experiences, particularly child sexual abuse, that actually interferes with our ability to regulate our feelings, keep our thinking organized, and maintain stability in our behavioral responses to stimulation. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just focus on one element, and I'm going to tell you the reason I wanted to present a little bit about one element of what happens in our brains in the midst of and what can often continue as a result of traumatization, is that we know that there are real implications in terms of how our brains and bodies respond differently to overwhelming events. So I want you to think that under normal circumstances, there's a regular communication that occurs between two parts of our brain, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. We think about the prefrontal cortex as organizing information, allows us to think in organized ways, to make decisions about actions. We think about the amygdala as a center of the chemistry of our emotions and plays a central role in responding to fear and threat and triggers fight-flight responses. Next. And so the communication between the prefrontal cortex and amygdala is significantly disrupted when we feel threatened by, when we're threatened in our safety and the safety of others, and when there are major serious disruptions to the way we live. At these times, our brains literally may not work the same way as they did the day before. When communication between these two parts of our brains is disrupted, the fight-flight responses are activated and stress reactions are amplified. This actually leads to an activation of increased production of what we refer to as stress hormones. And this in turn leads to increased physical and cognitive symptoms, anxiety, distress, and confusion. Literally, we're not able to think straight, and we are flooded with the intensity of our physical and emotional responses to this heightened release of stress hormones. Next. So when our stress levels are at their highest, our physical symptoms increase. Our ability to use thinking as a way of calming ourselves and taking control of our situations decreases. And when the amygdala is working overtime, the prefrontal cortex, which ordinarily organizes thoughts, analyzes problems, and initiates action plans, can be overwhelmed. These changes in physical and cognitive symptoms can further activate our alarm systems. In other words, it's not just a one-shot deal, that these changes can actually repeat and perpetuate the original experience of loss of control in the situation of abuse. This results not only in our world feeling out of control as a result of the experiences, but our reactions and feelings that follow from these experiences make us continue to feel out of control of ourselves as well. Next slide, please. When trauma occurs, when there is this major disruption of experiences, there are four major symptom areas, and these are under the headings of re-experiencing, avoidance, hyperarousal, and negative alterations in how we think and how we feel. Next slide, please. When we think about re-experiencing, we're thinking about things like traumatic reminders. That is, walking down the street and suddenly hearing a sound or hearing a noise or something that suddenly reminds you of the original traumatic event. Having intrusive memories in which it's hard to not be preoccupied or to suddenly be preoccupied with thoughts either about the original events or similar expressions of the fear and terror involved in those events. In children, we often see what we refer to as traumatic play and reenactment, where children's play becomes very narrowly defined and seems to focus, if not specifically on the events, then the themes that were aroused by those events. We see frequent nightmares, sometimes flashbacks and dissociation, which I'll talk about in a moment. Distressed whenever reminded, in other words, further activation of stress responses when we're reminded of what happened to us. We also see a heightened level of somatic complaints and discomfort. Next slide, please. Avoidance refers to actively avoiding thinking or talking about the events, avoiding any reminders of events. And I'd like you to keep in mind, imagine what impact this has for a young child or an older child, and how this can continue over the course of a lifetime when people are unable to recover from these original events. Impaired recollection or memory, new fears, increased separation, fear of being alone, darkness, strangers, and sometimes a sense of foreshortened future, that is, that a sense of impending doom. Next slide, please. When we talk about hyperarousal, and just a reminder, these are all of the areas of symptomatology, not necessarily all the specifics, but these are the areas that people who have been traumatized experience in the early wake of traumatic experiences, but when there is no recovery, these can endure and have an impact on subsequent development. Nightmares, difficulty falling or staying asleep, decreased ability to attend or concentrate, feelings of hyperactivity, irritability, changes in mood, increased aggression or aggressive feelings, and hypervigilance or exaggerated startle response. And by that, we mean the experience of constantly being on the lookout for further danger, or having intense responses with sudden changes in sound or sight that can automatically elevate and re-trigger heightened stress responses. Next slide, please. We also talk about negative alterations in cognition and mood, in which, once again, we refer to interference with memories of traumatic events, negative beliefs about oneself, others, or the world, including self-blaming, diminished interest in significant activities and activities that have previously been of interest, or withdrawal that actually precludes involvement in activities that might otherwise be sources of interest. Feelings of detachment or feeling emotionally distant from others, and persistent inability to experience consistent positive emotions. Next slide, please. We know a great deal about what happens when kids are unable to, number one, be identified as being victims, and where there is inadequate support or treatment. We know, in fact, that without recognition, support, and treatment, early traumatic reactions can persist and interfere with optimal development and result in long-term deleterious outcomes that have implications in terms of chronic psychosocial, psychiatric, and physical health difficulties as well. Just some examples are PTSD, again, higher risks for PTSD, depression, problems with anxiety, dissociative symptoms, and by dissociative we mean the automatic disconnect between thoughts and feelings and inability to actually integrate thoughts and feelings, particularly around the original events or anything that is a reminder of vulnerability and loss of control. increased risk for substance misuse, re-victimization, chronic health problems, early entry into unstable and poorly functioning relationships, and lastly, personality disorders, meaning adaptations that are chronically interfering across a range of areas of adult functioning. Next slide, please. So again, I'm sure that everyone in this audience has a very deep, and many of you unfortunately have a very personal understanding of the experience and what we mean by sexual abuse. But the National Child Traumatic Stress Network defines sexual abuse as any interaction between a child and an adult in which the child is used for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or an observer. Sexual abuse can include both touching and non-touching behaviors. Non-touching behaviors can include voyeurism, exhibitionism, and exposing the child to pornography. Next slide, please. Child sexual abuse as one type of traumatic experience is well recognized as one of the most powerful and significant traumatic experiences for children. Finkelhor and his colleagues proposed that child sexual abuse is especially traumatic because of 4 additionally unique traumatogenic dynamics. Traumatic sexualization, in which the normal experience of sexual pleasure becomes contaminated by a host of sources of distress, overstimulation, and the like. Betrayal, as so often child sexual abuse, the majority occurs in the abusers are family members or people known to the child. Absolute sense of powerlessness, and the experience of stigmatization. It's this combination of factors that is particularly unique in combination with one another that we see so regularly in situations involving child sexual abuse. Next slide, please. What I'm about to say, I'm going to say briefly. It may be self-evident, but sexual abuse is an experience that a child is simply not developmentally equipped to comprehend or process. And when child sexual abuse goes unrecognized, there's an absence of family and social supports, there's an absence of treatment, and children are absolutely left on their own to deal with the traumatic dysregulation and all of the symptoms that follow. Symptoms of traumatic dysregulation that regularly follow the experience of sexual abuse can become chronic adaptations. They can endure, not only having impact on the immediate experience in the phase of development the child's in, but can, in an additive way, have an impact on unfolding development. And these can have profound negative outcomes over the lifespan. Next slide, please. So I want to, just before closing, talk a little bit about the issue of this delayed disclosure. And again, as all of you may know, the delayed disclosure is much more common than immediate disclosure of child sexual abuse. And again, the US Department of Justice estimated in the study that 86% of sexual assaults in general, including child sexual abuse, goes unreported. This is an extraordinary demonstration of how alone, isolated, and unheard victims and subsequent survivors of child sexual abuse are. In another study, 60 to 70% of child sexual abuse survivors did not disclose until they were adults. And interestingly, in another study of 4,339 adolescents with 65% girls, 23% boys, 59% of this sample of adolescents had not disclosed their sexual abuse prior to the survey itself. Another study, again, supports this notion that the majority of adults who were victims of child sexual abuse indicated that they did not disclose their abuse as children. As you all well know, thanks to Child USA, the average age of disclosure of child sexual abuse is 52 years. Next slide, please. There are many factors that interfere with disclosure, but it's important for us to appreciate, again, the dilemma that, that children who've experienced child sexual abuse are confronted with. They themselves have difficulties in understanding, let alone verbalizing the experiences of abuse, including, for many kids, even recognizing that they've been abused. Another interference can be when threats of violence and the emotional consequences of breaking secrecy pacts are so profound, especially when the perpetrator is a family member or trusted figure. So often, and it's so hard for people who have not had this experience or can't understand, why didn't you tell someone? These are complicated issues that actually help us to understand why it's so hard to disclose, including the survivor's ambivalence toward an abuser, including the potential risk of the most important attachments in the child's life and a threat to care, especially when the abuser is a caregiver or family member. The enormous amount of self-blame versus blaming the abuser for the abuse and the resulting confusion about who's really responsible. Next slide, please. Shame and guilt, the sense of humiliation that comes when the sense of the most important sense of control is taken away. That is, control of one's body. Post-traumatic defensive avoidance, literally not being able to think or recall, as we see in dissociation, as well as the impact of depression and anxiety on our ability to think in clearer, more direct ways. These are not separate items, but often experiences and sources of interference that are experienced all at the same time by the survivor of child sexual abuse. Lastly, perceptions of oneself as bad and unworthy as a result of the experience of loss of control, the sense of shame and humiliation. Next slide, please. Just to close, I just wanted to share briefly some implications. Simply put, too many children remain isolated as they struggle to deal with the traumatic impact of their child sexual abuse experiences. For many, they're not only robbed of the most fundamental control of their bodies, but they're also robbed of the confidence and trust in the adults upon whom they rely. For too many children, the consequences of unresolved traumatic experience also rob them of their optimal developmental potential that can reverberate throughout their adult lives. Lastly, when survivors of child sexual abuse remain unrecognized and unheard, the injustice and injury of their original traumatic experiences are only revisited and perpetuated in their adult lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marans. I think we heard, and I would just want to repeat quickly that this morning on Where We Live, there was a conversation in which Dr. Marans was part of, and as well as Catherine Robb from Child USA and Lori Temple, one of the SNAP, Connecticut SNAP co-leaders who are also worked with us on this, spoke about this, and we heard many of those things from Lori of what she has experienced as a survivor, and that she realized, I sort of really came to her in her late 50s, and by then that the statute of limitation was out, she couldn't use it. And so I guess that sort of tees it up for Professor Hamilton to speak to that, but also to speak to some of the healing effects that being able to go and look at your perpetrator or look at the person who harmed you and go to the courts and as an adult can help in healing. So Dr. Hamilton, I'm Professor Hamilton.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. Dr. Marans, it's an honor to be on a panel with you. You're doing some wonderful work. And today I'm going to talk about essentially, and thank you to the Alliance and Lucy. I didn't want to let that go. So today I'm going to talk about the way in which the statute of limitations reform movement has moved the ball so that we learn more about child sex abuse, we help more victims, and maybe most importantly, we inform the public about the dangers to children that they never would have imagined before. Next slide. So what is an SOL? Well, it's pretty easy. Of course, it has another meaning as well, but we're trying to make it not that meaning. It's a statute of limitations. And the statutes are just deadlines. That's all they are. So there are deadlines for contract disputes. There's no deadline for murder, and then everything in between. And we're always dealing with both criminal statutes of limitations, which is when the victim can go sue, press charges against a perpetrator, and they may be put in jail or fined. The civil statute of limitations, by contrast, doesn't have the power to put anyone in jail, but it does create the opportunity to have those who caused the abuse to pay for the harm that followed. And we know from Department of Justice that the average amount of harm done to a victim is about $830,000 over the course of their lives. And that's an average, some less, some significantly more. We study SOLs at Child USA. We're a nonprofit think tank. We put social science and law together. The Sean P. McElmail Statute of Limitations Research Institute was founded because Sean passed away of a drug overdose when he was the only person who could possibly press charges against his perpetrator and a priest who'd been abusing children for 30 years. Next slide, please. So we have this issue of delayed disclosure, which Dr. Marans has really beautifully explained the science behind the reality, which is that we know that many adults have never told anyone, or they may have told a friend, or they may have told someone who was never going to bring them to the legal system. And the average is 52 years old to come forward. About a third of kids come forward when they're children, but not necessarily to the authorities. About a third come forward during their lifetimes, and then there's a good third that never come forward at all. And as you saw from Dr. Marans, there are lots of different slices of facts about this, but the bottom line for lawmakers is they need to understand that child sexual abuse is not like breaking your leg. When you break your leg, you call out to your parents, they take you to the emergency room, you get a cast, and all your friends sign it. There's no question you've been harmed. With respect to child sex abuse, a child does not have the context to understand, especially when it's done by someone they trust, someone they love. And children simply don't understand that sex may actually feel good physically, but be horrific for their health and their future, and frankly, the adults in their lives. So for children, they don't get it. And they may not get it until they're an adult, because you usually don't understand that you lost your childhood until you are an adult. A kid going through their childhood doesn't have that opportunity. So next slide, please. So they delay disclosing for all the reasons Dr. Marans said, and it's the effect of the trauma. And for many, these children are in situations where they just can't communicate it because they don't understand it, or because the adults around them all trust the perpetrator and can't hear what the child is saying. Next slide, please. So we mark at Child USA, we mark the beginning of the upward tick in access to justice for child sex abuse victims with 2002 and the movie Spotlight. Why? Not the movie, but the reality behind the movie. 20 years ago, this month, the Boston Globe put out a story that showed not that an individual perpetrator had sexually abused a child, as had been revealed in Louisiana with a priest named Gautier in the 80s. No, this was the first time the public could comprehend that an institution was responsible for enabling predators, child predators, and at the same time covering it up. And so what we saw as an institution in the Boston Archdiocese that was perfectly capable of knowing about seriatim abuse by a priest, very charismatic, Shanley, involved with NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association, and then a much older priest, John Gagan, who had so many victims over the course of his career as a priest. And so the systemic quality, the fact that this is something that is not just a perpetrator, it's a whole system putting children at risk. This is what we saw. And then the next paradigm example, we have the Catholic Church, and then in 2011, a little over 10 years ago, we have Penn State. So we have two major examples out there of institutions that people love and rely on for different reasons, of course, but that permitted children to be sexually abused child after child. Next slide, please. So the truth is that statute of limitations reform is for child sex abuse victims, but it is needed by the public. And so the three primary ways that we benefit as a culture, and not just individual victims from SOL reform, is that it does identify hidden child predators and the institutions that endanger children. When you open up a legal avenue for a victim, now we find out that children were being sexually abused in California, in New York, in Illinois, and all of a sudden you know that that Boston Archdiocese was not by itself responsible. It was a whole institution across the country. And then you also learn, once you hear about Larry Nassar and USA Gymnastics, you then start to have survivors coming forward who are saying, wait a minute, my doctor at my university sexually abused me too. USC, UCLA, Ohio State University, and University of Michigan, all examples of doctors who have destroyed people's lives and been covered up by institutions. And right now in the United States, because this is a state-by-state issue, you were able to get justice in New York. You were able to get justice and reveal your identity in California and many other states. But Ohio and Michigan have kept it quiet. And so for those child predators, those child abuse victims, they are in trouble, because the way our system works is that we prefer and protect adults. It's an instinct in the system that we have to learn to overcome. But since we prefer and protect adults, if a child abuse victim comes forward and there is no statute of limitations reform, they cannot be in the protection of the judiciary. You either are risking defamation lawsuits against you, or you are risking business practices lawsuits against you. So right now in the United States, there are defamation lawsuits by perpetrators against their own victims, trying to shut them up because they're in states where the statute of limitations doesn't give the victim a cause of action. We have just recently seen a filing in Chicago against really the longest known USA Volleyball perpetrator, and he's suing his victim in order to be able to argue that she's ruining his business. So you need the statute of limitations reform, not just for what is desperately needed, which is damages and compensation for the harm and the lifelong possibility of needing therapy. But you also need it for when a child sex abuse victim comes forward, they're safe. They're in the legal system. And it's going to be a lot harder to be able to sue for defamation and for business practice interference than it is if they can go to court, the victims go to court, they get the discovery, and they get the truth out to the world about how the cover-up occurred and how they enabled this particular perpetrator. So that's one. That's a big public benefit both ways because we get the truth. But it also educates the public about the prevalent signs and impact of child sex abuse so they can be prevented. The public to this day tends to repeatedly underestimate the amount of child sex abuse that occurs across the board, whether it's families, gyms, or churches. But there is this desire to fix the problem. So say University of Michigan had this doctor who was sexually abusing the kids coming into University of Michigan and some young adults, and there was no statute of limitations open. Michigan had the shortest statute of limitations in the United States for quite a while. And if you think about it, it was age 19 when the average age of coming forward is in the early 50s. And the end result of that has been that the least amount of knowledge about sex abuse rampant in the state of Michigan, whether it's the universities or it's the gyms or it's the schools and families, nobody understands it. This is a matter of educating not just survivors who know the experience all too well. You've got to educate families. How do parents know what the signs are? How do they know the stories? How do they know that children aren't listened to unless you get the facts out to the public? And how do you know how to prevent it into the future? And how do you persuade judges this is real? This delayed disclosure is not just a decision to just slow down, not report, and then you reach a certain age and then you go after the money, because that is the normal defense that's raised. And frankly, these large institutions want nothing more than for all of this to disappear so that these institutions that are beloved can just fill back in right where the explosion occurred and the truth was coming out. So we need to know who child predators are right now, and they may be doing it now, and they may have been doing it 30 years ago. Age is not a deterrent to child predators. It educates the public. And finally, and this is just the basis of the fairness of the United States justice system, it shifts the cost of the abuse from the victims and the taxpayers to the ones who caused it. Right now, victims in most states are having to bear the cost of their own abuse. And taxpayers in many circumstances end up paying because victims suffer. They don't achieve their potentials. They may not be capable of a full and rewarding career or education. And so the victims need to rely on Medicaid, or they need to rely on state resources and local resources in order to be able to just survive. So with these three elements, statute of limitations reform needs to be at the top of every state who wants to defeat child sex abuse. Next slide, please. So we rank the child sex abuse statutes of limitations by jurisdiction. Go to childusa.org, go to our law page. There's more information than you probably ever want. But we track the criminal and civil, federal and state statutes of limitations in the United States weekly. So we update it every Thursday, and you will find out. The current stats are that we're making a lot more progress on criminal statute of limitation elimination in 49 states in some variety. We've got 17 states that have just thrown out their civil statutes of limitations. And we have 27 states that have revived or provided a window for the victims from the past, for those who had expired civil claims. Next slide, please. Yeah. So 2002 is when Connecticut, along with the revelations coming out, did do something at the time that was way ahead of its time. So what they did is they said victims of child sex abuse are going to be able to come forward for civil claims up to the age of 48, and it was retroactive. So if your claim had already expired and you were 35, you got to come forward. But they put an age cap on it of 48. To this day, Connecticut has an age cap for revival of age 48, which means it's missing out on a lot of survivors are not able to come forward. Next slide, please. So you go to our site and you can see how we rank, and we talk about the different types of revivals of expired child sex abuse civil claims. And let me just, on the side, just like a professor, I'll give you a footnote. The footnote is that you can't revive a criminal statute of limitations. Once it expires, that's it for the criminal side. So for the vast majority of victims in the United States, most of them cannot bring a criminal claim. And so if they can't press charges, that means the only thing they could do, because all their statute of limitations have expired, is to have their civil claims revived. So for most of our victims from the past, that's our only option, but it's a pretty powerful one. The movement is we started in California in 2003, and we had a 1 year during which we had what we call a window. All claims of child sexual abuse were revived, and we had about 1,150 victims come forward. We learned about many institutions, including, of course, the Catholic Church, but Explorer Scouts, other religious organizations, families, etc. And so that was the beginning of trying to claw back an opportunity for the victims to be able to get some justice and get the truth to the public. That has evolved so that Hawaii actually has had a window open 3 times for a total of 6 years. And Vermont and now Maine, the Marianas Islands, and also Guam have just basically erased their civil statute of limitations backwards and forwards, which is, that's the future. That's where we're headed. And the logic is irrefutable that child sex abuse victims need the time and the public needs to know what's going on. And so we fully expect the intermediate windows that have been open for 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, we expect in the future to see these SOLs eliminated backwards and forwards. And that's the only way we're going to solve this problem at the foundation, and then be able to work up with all the other things that we need to do. Next slide, please. So this is Connecticut. You can go to childusa.org/law to see what's going on. It has finally, at this point, eliminated all criminal statutes of limitations involving child sexual exploitation or child sex abuse. It wasn't long ago that they did it, though. So many, many claims had already expired before they completely eliminated. But Connecticut sets the standard now on the criminal side for all victims going forward. For the victims from the past, Connecticut basically, as I said, goes up to age 48 for the victims from the past. For victims going forward, they have till age 51. There was a 3 years added, but it's not a revival. There's a lot to do still in Connecticut, but right now, most of your victims are not able to file criminally because of the changes in the criminal SOL most recently. Just wasn't soon enough. And then the civil SOL blocks people out at age 48. Next slide, please. And so to explain where Connecticut ranks among all states, criminal and civil, right there in the mediocre middle. They're not the worst, and they're far from the best. But they're mediocre, and what that means is a lot of victims aren't telling their stories safely, and a lot of people in Connecticut don't know exactly the extent of the dangers that children are facing in every institution. Next slide, please. So let me just close by saying this is a vibrant movement. It is a movement that I hope every survivor will find the strength when they do to get involved in it. But if you're a survivor and you're not ready to go public and you're not ready to be testifying, that's okay. This is being carried by a whole movement across the United States. What we want to do is benefit all survivors, but that doesn't mean anyone who's not ready should come forward before they're ready. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. I mean, Professor Hamilton. That was really laid out what's going on, both with Dr. Marans being able to, I think the front end and the back end really put the two together. And I have to say that that's what we hear in Connecticut is that we do, and one of the reasons we wanted to hold this webinar today was that we want to show that delayed disclosure is a real thing, that trauma from child sexual abuse is a real thing, that it costs a lot to victims, and that the money, you know, I think one of the things we heard this morning again was that it's not just the money, because people aren't looking for millions of dollars, which is what we get handed out. They're going to look for deep pockets, but they're looking for some sense of self, as well as maybe to pay some of the costs that they've had to have throughout their life. And I think Professor Hamilton, what is the average cost per victim of child sexual abuse?
So the average cost over their life is $830,000, but in the lawsuits, the average that's been received in the Catholic lawsuits out in California, the MSU lawsuits with the Nassar survivors, has been about 1.5 million. And that's an average. That means some of the survivors are getting 30,000, some are getting 3.5 million. It depends on the degree of the damage in the individual person. You know, the reason we can't do class actions for child sex abuse is each individual is affected by child sex abuse according to where they are in the world, the support they have, and it's an individual response.
Thank you. Dr. Marans, we have a question about what percentage of victims of sexual violence under 18 develop PTSD?
It's a great question, and it's hard to know the exact number, again, in part because there's so much underreporting. I think that what we do know is that the greatest risks are some of the ones that Professor Hamilton was laying out so beautifully. That the isolation that is created by all of the things I was describing, but also these are layered impacts. And what Professor Hamilton was talking about in terms of public awareness is, again, the broader approach to taking the blinders off. So what we do know is that those kids who are at greater risk are kids in which no one ever recognizes or even begins to make a connection to their troubles and the possibility that there is a traumatic source of those troubles. And so we know on the flip side, and I think it's really important to underline, that actually we have found ways of helping kids achieve greater mastery over their traumatic experiences. And I say that for a reason, that the desperation and the sense of this is how I'm going to feel forever is an understandable experience when one perpetually is experiencing those awful impacts of child sexual abuse. It's equally important to remind people that when they are ready, when they are achieving a recognition that they were abused, that they have suffered, that there are treatment approaches for both kids and adults that can be enormously helpful in aiding recovery.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm looking at my questions here. One of the other questions was, what are the obstacles to statute of limitations reform at the federal level?
Yeah, so we have this, interesting dual sovereigns in the United States. We have the federal government and the state governments, and they're each individually sovereign. So, and largely criminal law, like child sex abuse, belongs to each state for crimes that occurred in the state. So first of all, you have 50 states. Secondly, the federal government cannot mandate statutes of limitations for the states. That's just part of our federalism system. So, but what can the federal government do? And we're working on it right now. So there are several bills in Congress that would incentivize the states. It would provide more child protection dollars if the state were to improve its child sex abuse statutes of limitations. And our proposal is a sliding scale. If you do it all, you enact, you revive, you get rid of them, you should get more, because now you're saving the whole country money. For each victim, as Dr. Marans knows better than I, you need a lot of one-on-one treatment to be able to help them. That costs money. And then to be able to help their families. And so there is a possibility of two other ways to fix the statute of limitations from the federal government. One is there is a bill proposed that would be a federal statute of limitations that would in effect create a federal tort. And it's pending. And then there's another bill that would essentially fix Title IX, because Title IX right now is dependent on the state. Who are the forces against us? The forces against us are the organized forces of the insurance industry, although we are talking to them about becoming part of the prevention solution instead of continuing to be on the wrong side of the cover-up. But insurance, the Catholic bishops are heavily invested. Millions are being spent to try to stop these bills, and the Boy Scouts, of course, now that they've been sued by 82,000 victims. So how do you get around those kinds of behemoths? You just tell the truth and you give them the data, and lawmakers, when they see the data, they understand the data, they eventually do the right thing. So this is just a massive educational lift. But we need all these SOLs open so the education is even better.
Thank you. We had, I think one of the things that, one of the things that you said, Professor Hamilton, is that victims and survivors need the time and the public needs to know. And I throwing that back to Dr. Marans, because one of the things that stuck out to me in your presentation was that children, and we hear this all the time, they have no idea. They self-blame, they don't know what happened to them, or that what we know that in grooming, there's so much manipulation and everything that goes on, and that these children, they're the reasons why it happened, when that's not the truth at all. But I guess the question is, do you feel that the more we can get this out and as adults recognize what's happened to them, that this will help children in the long run?
Absolutely. And I just want to underline it directly today. I'm so grateful to you all and to Professor Hamilton, because the experience, if one were to summarize, it's terrible to go through awful experiences, overwhelming experiences, and it's even worse to have to continue to be left alone and isolated.
Yeah. And
so the work that's being described that Professor Hamilton and you all are leading the charge on is actually, the best way I can put it is, what can lurk in the shadows is much greater than what can lurk in the light of day. And that has direct implications for not only children not feeling alone and not feeling that they are the only ones, that there's something wrong with them. But that applies to adult survivors as well. And so the short answer to your question is absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. And what does something that Dr. Hamilton and Professor Hamilton just said was about the cost of the trauma of working with children and trauma. And can you explain, Dr. Marans, a little bit about what you do when you're working with CSA or child sexual assault survivors?
Sure. After learning a lot from victims and seeing up close and personal the experiences of children and families who've been victims of many types of trauma, but often, very frequently, a large proportion of our work is with children who've been sexually abused. Again, it goes back to illumination. So we've worked to increase the places in which children are most likely to be identified by increasing understanding and awareness, so that when teachers are noticing children who are troubled, when kids come into emergency departments in the hospital, when the police are involved in investigations, and most important, capitalizing on child advocacy centers which do forensic evaluations. But we've developed an early brief intervention when we're able to locate and identify kids just after their disclosures, after they've gone through the process. It's also an opportunity to identify that they also may be suffering some of the post-traumatic symptomatology that I was outlining. We developed a brief early intervention family strengthening model that helps kids find words for what they're actually experiencing symptomatically in order to reduce the continued experience of absence of control. But the second part is helping caregivers appreciate what's going on for their kids. And thirdly, to increase the communication between the two and to find measures and strategies for turning the volume down on the dysregulation that I was describing earlier. And what we found is that it's enormously helpful. So this is not just about what the treaters are doing. It's actually building into the treatment. And the same is true with longer term trauma-focused treatment, of actually building in greater support where the child needs it the most from the caregivers. In order for them to do that, they first have to be able to recognize, tolerate the reality of what's happened to their child, and secondly, be available to listen and to find ways of helping to support the child's recovery.
Thank you.
Lucy, could I add?
Absolutely.
So first of all, it just makes me smile listening to all that, because so many suffering people out there who need it. But I just want to let everybody know, we have established a library on child sex abuse. It is for survivors, teachers, family members. It's resources. And Dr. Marans, you and I need to chat about what resources you think we need to add. But it is a safe place for a survivor to go if they're trying to figure out what the heck happened to me. And so if you go to, I'm embarrassed to say it's called the Hamilton Library. That's my staff's fault. But it's the Hamilton Library on childusa.org. And it's where everybody needs to go if they want to understand what the heck happens, how can I prevent it, but also how can I deal with it if it's already happened.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you both. We're at our time, but I just want to, if there's just a quick something that either one of you would like to summarize, I think if you have, or we can.
The only thing I wanted to add, and I'm sorry that earlier when I asked when we were recording if you'd mentioned the NPR piece, but I wanted to specifically express my gratitude to Lori Temple and Catherine Robb, who actually told their stories, and what acts of courage, but also what a tremendous gift that I think goes to exactly what Professor Hamilton was describing.
Yeah.
And right back at you, Professor Hamilton, because we could learn a lot in terms of additional resources that we can make available.
Great.
So I look forward to our communicating.
Great.
And thank you all for organizing this.
Well, thank you.
So much. And let's just celebrate survivors.
Right.
They're fighting the best they can, and we really need to help them as much as we can.
We do. And I really appreciate the two of you coming together with us to to talk about this, and we really look forward to continuing our work, and glad that we could pair you together. So we will only get stronger and better with our combined work. So thank you very much. Thank everyone again. I just want to, as Dr. Marans reminded me, that this morning on Where We Live, there was a conversation about basically sort of the trauma and the need for eliminating the civil statute of limitations. And it was a very good piece with, and really we heard from a survivor's point of view of why, why it's so critical. And so it's on again tonight, not that I'm doing sales for NPR, but it's on tonight at 8 on our Connecticut Public, but also I think on the Where We Live podcast will have it as well. So thank you all. And we will hopefully see you at the legislature.